The morning sky was painted in shades of gold and pink as the royal aircraft prepared for departure from Heathrow Airport. Inside the luxurious cabin, everything appeared to be running according to the carefully planned schedule that had been rehearsed countless times by the royal staff. King Charles III sat comfortably in his designated seat, reviewing documents for his upcoming state visit to Germany, while the usual complement of security personnel took their positions throughout the aircraft. Among the protection officers was Detective Sergeant Michael Harrison, a 28-year-old guard who had recently been promoted to the elite Royal Protection Unit. This was his first international assignment with the king, and the weight of responsibility sat heavily on his shoulders. Michael had spent years working his way up through the ranks of the Metropolitan Police, dreaming of the day he would serve in such a prestigious role. His crisp uniform was immaculate, his posture straight, and his eyes constantly scanning for any potential threats. The flight crew completed their final safety checks while the royal entourage settled into their seats. Michael noticed how different this aircraft was from any commercial flight he had experienced. The interior was decorated with understated elegance, featuring cream-colored leather seats, polished wood panels, and the royal coat of arms subtly embedded in various design elements. The atmosphere was one of quiet professionalism, with each staff member knowing exactly their role and responsibilities. As the aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, Michael felt a surge of pride. He was representing not just himself, but the entire Metropolitan Police Force and the Crown itself. His training had prepared him for various scenarios, from medical emergencies to security threats, but nothing had prepared him for what was about to unfold 30,000 feet above the ground. The takeoff was smooth, and as London grew smaller beneath them, Michael allowed himself a moment to appreciate the magnitude of his position. His radio crackled softly with routine communications between the security team, and he adjusted his earpiece to ensure clear reception. The king appeared relaxed, occasionally glancing out the window at the countryside below while continuing to work on his papers. Captain James Morrison, the senior protection officer, moved quietly through the cabin, checking on each member of the security detail. Morrison was a veteran with over 15 years of royal protection experience, and his presence commanded respect from everyone on board. When he reached Michael's seat, he nodded approvingly at the young officer's attentiveness. But there was something in Morrison's expression that suggested he was evaluating more than just basic protocol adherence. The aircraft reached its cruising altitude, and the pilot announced they were on schedule for their arrival in Berlin. Michael felt the slight change in cabin pressure and instinctively checked his watch. Everything was proceeding normally, or so it seemed. What he didn't know was that Captain Morrison had been observing his performance since the moment they boarded, taking mental notes about every aspect of Michael's conduct, unknown to Michael. There had been concerns raised about his readiness for such a high-profile assignment. Some senior officials questioned whether his promotion had been too rapid, whether he truly understood the complexities and nuances of royal protection work. The flight was, in essence, serving as a real-world evaluation of his capabilities under the unique pressures that came with protecting the monarch. As the flight progressed over the English Channel, Michael remained vigilant, occasionally making eye contact with other security personnel to confirm that all was well. The cabin was quiet except for the gentle hum of the engines and the soft rustle of papers as the king continued his work. The atmosphere was peaceful, almost routine, giving no indication of the dramatic events that were about to unfold. The king paused in his reading and glanced around the cabin, his experienced eyes taking in the professional demeanor of his protection detail. Having worked with numerous security officers over the years, he had developed an ability to read people quickly, understanding their strengths and weaknesses almost intuitively. His gaze lingered for a moment on Michael, and there was a thoughtful expression on the monarch's face that suggested he too was forming impressions about the newest member of his protection team. The unexpected turbulence hit the aircraft like an invisible wall, causing several passengers to grip their armrests tightly. Michael immediately activated his emergency protocols, checking that the king's seatbelt was secure while maintaining his own position. The aircraft shuddered through another pocket of rough air, and the captain's voice came over the intercom, apologizing for the bumpy conditions and assuring everyone that they would soon be through the worst of it. During this moment of distraction, Michael made what would later be recognized as a critical error. In his eagerness to ensure the king's comfort and safety, he left his assigned position to retrieve a fallen document that had slipped from the monarch's lap during the turbulence. The movement seemed natural and helpful, but it directly violated one of the fundamental rules of royal protection. Never abandon your designated post without explicit authorization from the senior protection officer. Captain Morrison witnessed the breach immediately. His experienced eyes caught the unauthorized movement, and his expression hardened. In the world of royal protection, such deviations from protocol were not minor infractions, but serious violations that could potentially compromise the entire security operation. Morrison's training and years of experience had taught him that even the smallest lapses in protocol could cascade into major security vulnerabilities. The turbulence subsided, and the flight resumed its smooth progress toward Germany. However, the atmosphere among the security team had subtly shifted. Morrison approached Michael with measured steps, his face betraying no emotion but his intent clearly serious. When he reached the young officer's seat, he leaned down and spoke in a low, firm voice that only Michael could hear. Michael's face flushed with embarrassment and concern as Morrison quietly but decisively informed him of the consequences of his actions. The words hit him like a physical blow. He was being immediately demoted from his position as an active protection officer for the remainder of the flight. Instead of serving in his prestigious role, he would be relegated to administrative support duties, essentially becoming a passenger observer rather than a functional member of the security detail. The demotion was not just a symbolic gesture, but a practical reality with immediate implications. Michael was required to surrender his active communication equipment and move to a different seat, one that was clearly designated for support personnel rather than primary security officers. The change was subtle enough that most casual observers might not notice, but to the trained eyes of the royal staff and the remaining protection officers, the message was unmistakable. As Michael gathered his belongings and prepared to move to his reassigned position, he felt the weight of disappointment crushing down on him. This was supposed to be the pinnacle of his career, the moment when all his years of training and dedication paid off. Instead, he found himself facing what felt like professional humiliation at 30,000 feet above the ground. With nowhere to hide and no way to immediately rectify his mistake, the king, who had been quietly observing the interaction between Morrison and Michael, became increasingly aware that something significant had occurred within his protection detail. His years of experience with security protocols gave him insight into the gravity of what he was witnessing. The monarch understood that protection officers were held to the highest standards, and any deviation from established procedures was taken with utmost seriousness. Other passengers in the cabin, including royal staff members and accompanying officials, began to notice the subtle changes in the security arrangement. Whispered conversations started among those who understood the significance of what they were observing. Word began to spread quietly through the cabin that one of the protection officers had been disciplined during the flight. Though the specific details remained unclear to most observers, Michael took his new seat, his mind racing with thoughts about the potential consequences this incident would have on his career. He knew that such incidents were thoroughly documented and reviewed by multiple levels of supervisory personnel. The possibility that this could result in his complete removal from the Royal Protection Unit was a devastating prospect that he tried not to contemplate too deeply. The aircraft continued its journey over Europe, but the peaceful atmosphere of the early flight had been replaced by an undercurrent of tension. Michael sat in his reassigned position, no longer an active participant in the security operations, but forced to watch as his colleagues continued their duties without him. The isolation was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his situation, as he found himself suddenly disconnected from the team he had worked so hard to join. As news of the mid-flight demotion spread among the passengers, various reactions began to emerge throughout the cabin. Some of the royal staff exchanged concerned glances, understanding that such disciplinary action during an active mission was highly unusual and indicated a serious breach of protocol. The atmosphere became charged with an uncomfortable tension that seemed to affect everyone on board. From the most senior officials to the newest staff members, Michael sat in his reassigned seat, fighting to maintain his composure while internally wrestling with the magnitude of his situation. Every few minutes, he would catch glimpses of his former colleagues continuing their duties, and each observation served as a painful reminder of what he had lost through his momentary lapse in judgment. The comfortable leather seat that had initially seemed luxurious now felt like a prison, confining him to watch helplessly as his career potentially crumbled around him. Captain Morrison continued his rounds through the cabin, but his demeanor had become noticeably more rigid. The incident had not only affected Michael, but had also created additional stress for the entire security team. Morrison knew that any breach of protocol, no matter how minor it might appear, could be scrutinized extensively by his superiors upon their return. The responsibility for his team's performance ultimately rested on his shoulders, and Michael's mistake reflected poorly on his leadership. The king, meanwhile, had set aside his documents and was observing the situation with growing interest and concern. His decades of experience working with protection officers had given him deep insight into their training, dedication, and the immense pressure they faced in their roles. He understood that these men and women sacrificed personal comfort and often put their lives at risk to ensure his safety, and he held tremendous respect for their professionalism and commitment. What particularly struck the monarch was the visible distress that the young officer was experiencing. King Charles had witnessed disciplinary actions before, but there was something about this situation that seemed different. Perhaps it was the officer's youth, or perhaps it was the genuine remorse and devastation that was clearly evident despite the young man's attempts to maintain professional composure. As the flight progressed over the European countryside, other passengers began to take sides in whispered conversations about the incident. Some felt that the discipline was appropriate and necessary, emphasizing that royal protection required absolute adherence to protocol without exception. Others, however, began to question whether the response had been overly harsh, particularly given that the officers' intentions had clearly been to provide additional assistance to the king during a moment of turbulence. The divide in opinion became more pronounced as details of the incident spread. Through informal conversations among the passengers, several royal staff members who had worked with protection officers for years expressed sympathy for Michael's situation, noting that his action, while technically incorrect, had been motivated by genuine concern for the king's welfare rather than any malicious intent or carelessness. Dr. Sarah Williams, the king's personal physician who was accompanying the royal party, found herself particularly moved by the situation. She had observed Michael's attentive behavior throughout the early part of the flight and had been impressed by his obvious dedication to his duties. When she witnessed his demotion and saw the emotional impact it was having on the young officer, she began to consider whether there might be an opportunity to advocate for a more compassionate response. The aircraft's communication system crackled to life as the pilot provided an update on their progress and estimated arrival time in Berlin. The routine announcement served as a reminder that despite the drama unfolding in the cabin, the flight's primary mission continued unchanged. The king would still need to be protected throughout the remainder of the journey and during the subsequent state visit, regardless of the internal conflicts affecting his security detail. Michael listened to the pilot's announcement with a growing sense of dread, realizing that their arrival in Berlin would likely mark the beginning of a formal review process that could end his career in royal protection. He knew that incidents like this were typically investigated thoroughly, with written reports submitted to multiple supervisory levels and potential consequences that could extend far beyond the immediate disciplinary action he had already received. King Charles continued to observe the young officer discreetly, noting the genuine distress that was evident despite Michael's professional training in maintaining emotional control. The monarch found himself increasingly troubled by what he was witnessing, not because he disagreed with the importance of security protocols, but because he recognized that sometimes the most rigid application of rules could result in outcomes that did not serve the broader interests of justice or human compassion. Asterisk. The tension in the cabin reached a pivotal moment when King Charles made an unexpected decision that would shock everyone present. Rising from his seat with deliberate purpose, the monarch began walking through the cabin, something that immediately drew the attention of every passenger and crew member. His movement was not the casual stroll of a relaxed traveler, but the purposeful stride of someone who had made an important decision and was determined to act upon it. Captain Morrison immediately moved to accompany the king as protocol dictated, but the monarch's destination became clear as he approached Michael's reassigned seat. Every conversation in the cabin ceased, and all eyes focused on what was clearly about to become a significant moment. The silence was so complete that the only sound was the gentle hum of the aircraft's engines as it continued its journey toward Berlin. When King Charles reached Michael's seat, he paused for a moment, studying the young officer's face with the same careful attention he had given to countless individuals throughout his years of public service. Michael, startled by the unexpected royal attention, began to rise from his seat, but the king gestured for him to remain seated. What followed was a conversation that no one in the cabin had anticipated and that would be remembered by every witness for years to come. Speaking in a voice that carried clearly through the quiet cabin, King Charles addressed Michael directly, acknowledging the difficult situation that had unfolded during the flight. The monarch's words were measured and thoughtful, demonstrating his understanding of both the importance of security protocols and the human elements that sometimes complicated their rigid application. He spoke about the nature of service, the inevitability of human error, and the importance of learning from mistakes rather than being destroyed by them. The king's intervention was not just unexpected, but completely unprecedented in the experience of everyone present. Royal protection protocols typically prevented such direct involvement by the monarch in disciplinary matters affecting his security detail. The fact that King Charles was choosing to personally address the situation demonstrated the depth of his concern and his commitment to principles that extended beyond simple adherence to established procedures. As the conversation continued, it became clear that the king was not merely offering words of comfort, but was actively challenging the disciplinary action that had been taken. He spoke about Michael's obvious dedication, the genuine nature of his intentions during the turbulence incident, and his belief that the response had been disproportionate to the offense. The monarch's words carried the weight of absolute authority, but they were delivered with a compassion that touched everyone who heard them. Captain Morrison found himself in an extraordinarily difficult position. His years of training and experience had taught him to maintain strict adherence to security protocols, but he was now facing direct intervention from the very person those protocols were designed to protect. The situation required him to balance his professional responsibilities with his duty to respect the king's wishes, creating a conflict that had no clear resolution within existing guidelines. The other passengers watched in amazement as this unprecedented drama unfolded before their eyes. Royal staff members who had worked for years within the formal structures of palace protocol were witnessing something completely outside their normal experience. The king was not just commenting on the situation, but was actively working to resolve it in a way that demonstrated his personal values and leadership philosophy. Dr. Williams, who had been considering whether to speak up on Michael's behalf, found herself moved by the king's intervention. She had seen many examples of royal compassion over the years, but this direct, personal involvement in resolving what could have been a career-ending situation for a young officer was something entirely different. It was a demonstration of leadership that went far beyond ceremonial duties and formal obligations. Michael himself was struggling to process what was happening. The shock of his demotion had been followed by the even greater shock of personal intervention by the king. The young officer had been trained to maintain professional distance and formal relationships with the royal family, But he now found himself at the center of a conversation that was both deeply personal and profoundly professional. The aircraft continued its flight over Europe, but the focus of everyone on board had shifted completely to the extraordinary scene unfolding in the cabin. Flight crew members who had initially been focused on their routine duties found themselves stealing glances at the unprecedented interaction between the king and the demoted protection officer, understanding that they were witnessing something that would likely become part of royal history. The resolution of the unprecedented mid-flight situation came when King Charles made a declaration that left everyone in the cabin speechless. With the authority that only a monarch could wield, he formally overruled the disciplinary action taken against Michael and ordered his immediate reinstatement to his original position within the protection detail. The decision was delivered with quiet confidence, making it clear that this was not a request but a royal directive that would be implemented immediately. Captain Morrison, despite his initial concerns about protocol violations, found himself faced with an order from the highest possible authority. The situation had evolved far beyond standard operating procedures, and he recognized that the king's intervention represented a level of decision-making that superseded all other considerations. With professional grace, Morrison acknowledged the royal directive and began the process of restoring Michael to his original duties. The practical implementation of the king's decision required several immediate changes throughout the cabin. Michael was instructed to return to his original seat and resume his position as an active member of the protection detail. His communication equipment was restored, and he was briefed on any developments that had occurred during his brief period of reassignment. The efficiency with which these changes were implemented demonstrated the professionalism of the entire team. Even in the face of such an unusual situation, as Michael returned to his duties, the emotional impact of what had transpired was evident to everyone who observed him. The combination of professional relief and personal gratitude was clearly visible, though he maintained the disciplined demeanor expected of a royal protection officer. His colleagues welcomed him back, with subtle nods and gestures that conveyed their support while maintaining the formal atmosphere required by their roles. The king's intervention had created a ripple effect throughout the cabin that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Royal staff members began discussing among themselves the implications of what they had witnessed, recognizing that the monarch's actions had demonstrated leadership principles that would likely influence their own approach to similar situations in the future. The emphasis on compassion, understanding, and second chances had resonated with everyone present. Dr. Williams approached the king privately after he had returned to his seat, expressing her admiration for his handling of the situation. Their quiet conversation reinforced the broader themes that had emerged from the incident, including the importance of balancing strict professional standards with human understanding, and the recognition that true leadership sometimes required going beyond established protocols to achieve just outcomes. The remainder of the flight to Berlin proceeded smoothly, but the atmosphere in the cabin had been permanently altered by the events that had unfolded. There was a sense among all present that they had witnessed something significant, a demonstration of royal leadership that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The incident had transformed what could have been a career-ending mistake into a powerful lesson about redemption and the importance of principled leadership. As the aircraft began its descent toward Berlin, Michael reflected on the extraordinary turn of events that had rescued his career and potentially changed his entire future. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about protocol adherence, but it had also demonstrated the importance of working for leaders who valued human dignity alongside professional excellence. His respect for King Charles had grown immeasurably through the personal intervention he had witnessed. Upon landing in Berlin, news of the incident began to spread beyond the confines of the aircraft. Airport officials and German security personnel, who were briefed on the flight's events, expressed amazement at the unprecedented nature of the king's intervention. Word of the story eventually reached media outlets, though the specific details were carefully managed to protect the privacy, and professional reputations of all involved. Parties. The long-term impact of the incident extended well beyond the immediate participants. Michael's career in royal protection continued to flourish, and he often cited the experience as a defining moment that shaped his approach to both professional duty and personal integrity. Captain Morrison incorporated lessons learned from the incident into his training programs for new protection officers, emphasizing the importance of balancing strict protocol adherence with situational awareness and human judgment. King Charles himself rarely spoke publicly about the incident, but those close to him noted that it represented his leadership philosophy in action. The decision to intervene personally demonstrated his commitment to fair treatment, his understanding of human nature, and his willingness to use his authority to promote justice and compassion even in the most formal and protocol-driven environments. The story of the mid-flight demotion and royal intervention became part of the informal history of the Royal Protection Unit, serving as an example of how unexpected situations could be resolved through principled leadership and human understanding. For everyone who witnessed the events on that flight to Berlin, it remained a powerful reminder that true authority was best exercised in service of both security and human dignity.